Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is the third in our React Ruby build, or Ruby on Rails build. And in the first video, we set up our project. In the second video, we created user authentication. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add the notes model to our project. Now technically it needs several pieces. We need a model, okay, which is going to be our class that's going to basically be the in-between between the database and our server. But we need to actually have the table in the database. We need a migration that creates the table in the database. We need a controller that defines all the functions that our routes will route to, and we need a routes file that does all the routes, and then we need actions, which are those functions inside the controller. Now there are two different commands you can do. Okay, you could do Rails. I mean, actually, I could make all of those individually, so I could just be like Rails generate migration, Rails generate controller, Rails generate model, and make all those pieces individually. And depending on the level of customization, that might be the most appropriate way to do it. Luckily, when you're doing something that's basic, Rails, one of the nicest things about Rails is that it gives you tools to really kind of spin that up really quickly. So we could generate what's called a resource. Now, a resource will generate the model for you, generate the migration for you, generate the routes, and the controller, but it does not add the actions, those individual functions. Okay? If you do want those individual functions, which we do, is we're going to use the command generate a scaffold. Scaffold sets up everything, essentially gives you full CRUD on a platter. So I'm going to generate a scaffold, which is going to be our note, okay, our note API. And it's going to have a couple different fields. So we're going to have a title, which is a string. We're going to have a body, which is going to be a longer form of text. And we're going to have a user, okay, which is a reference. And let me just make sure that I type that in right. I always forget if it's references or reference. Let me go back to my tutorial. Yeah, references. So user is a reference to the user model. Okay, so you always want to make sure you put the name of the user model there. So user references. Okay, so Railg scaffold, note title string, body text, user references. Okay, then we hit enter. And I forgot, I put rail, not rails. Okay, it's Rails generate scaffold. And you can do G for generate, which is shorthand. There we go. So it created all the files. So see, it created our migration file. It created a note model file. It created, well, we don't care about the test. So we'll skip those. It created the route resource notes. The resource keyword automatically adds the full CRUD routes. It created the controller. Okay, and the controller we'll see has all the functions that we need. But first, let's inspect the migration, make sure that the migration looks right. Okay, because it is auto-generated, so we want to make sure it looks the way we would like it to look. So I'm going to head over to app, and let's go to, actually, would that be there? I think it's actually going to be in DB. Yep, migrate. And I'm going to look for the newest migration file. Okay, the newest migration file, because basically the idea is that they're in an order. So if I were to create a new database, it would run these migrations in the order. So that way it makes sure that I always scaffold my database the way I did the last time. So we're creating a table called notes. Good. That has a string field called title, a text field called body, and a references field called user. Okay, can't be null, so it has to have a null, and it's a foreign key. Okay, so see, it set all that stuff up for us. Okay, so in that case, I might as well migrate. So I'm going to do db, well, Rails db migrate. Cool, so that's migrated. And then I want to take a look at the model. And if I take a look at the model note, it belongs to user. So every note belongs to a user. Okay, which is fine. Okay. So it just means that every node has to have a user associated with it. Because basically the idea is we want to create it where you log in and you can only see your notes. Okay, so that's fine with me. Now let's take a look at the controller. Here's a notes controller. Okay, so then here we see that um, before an action is going to set note, and it's again, this is only for show update. So this idea is if I'm targeting a specific note, this will grab the note that I specify by grabbing the ID param from the URL. Okay, and that's just, again, if you know the standard RESTful conventions, show routes, update routes, and destroy routes, you generally put the ID of the item at the end of the URL. That's standard convention of REST across all frameworks. Okay, if you're not familiar with those, look up the 7 RESTful routes. Actually, I'll just do it really quickly with you so you can see what I mean. So 7 RESTful routes. Okay. Here we go. So in this case, so again, if we take a look at these routes, so you see show route takes the ID, edit route takes the ID, update route takes the ID, destroy takes the ID. They all take the ID in the name. Now we don't care about edit because you don't make edits and you don't make new routes when you're making an API. So it's only the other 5. But the idea is that it'll take the ID from the URL, grab the note, and then add it as its own property. So that way you have, so if we go to like show routes, so if we were to go to update, so you see here, at note, see this note property is the actual note that was created, or the note that was pulled from the database. And the reason it has that property is because of this before action. In the same way, we'll have access to the user, because again, we inherited from application controller, which has that whole authentication thing, which on that note, we need to make sure we add that. So before action. So again, a before action is we're passing in a function to run before any of these routes. And we want to put in the authorization one. I think it's called authorization. I'll double check. So if I go to the users controller, I should see it. Authorize. So authorize is what it's called. Okay, because that's what we set up when we set up the thing. So we'll change this to authorized. So bottom line is like that whole, I need to have my token submitted every time I want to hit any of these routes. That's what that's going to do. So you can't hit a note route without logging in first. Okay, so then the other thing I need to make sure is that a user gets assigned for every route. Okay, so in that case, let's see here, note equals note.new, note params. Okay, but we also need to make sure that it has a user attached to it. So we're going to say at note.user equals at user dot ID. Okay, that should be the user ID, because again, let me just double check. But let's take a look at the application controller. Yeah, so they're creating a property called user every time that authorize function runs. So we'll be able to access that user's ID. Cool. So that all works for me. Where did it go? Notes controller. Okay, so that should do that. Okay, and then when we show, we don't want note all. We want to find based on a certain ideal. Okay, so bottom line here, they're basically saying, hey, we're going to find based on ID. Okay, what I want to do is find based on the username. Okay, so note, so I'm going to change this to find. And I want to change this to, I think I would pass in ID. Let me think about that for a second. I think I want to say like ID is at user.id. And actually, no, that would be user. Okay, and let me just to double check that. Let's look up that syntax for Rails find. So model.find Rails. Here we go. Let's take a look. Nope. Here we go. Client.find 10. And with the primary key of 10. Okay. 110. I want to find one based on a specific field. Now the first I order from, here we go, find by. So that's probably what I want. So client.find by. Okay, so find by first name LIFO. Okay, so that's what we want to do. So it's really should just be find underscore by. Find by. I don't need the parentheses necessarily. Find by where users at user ID. Okie dokie. Because again, that way it only brings up all the IDs for that user. Show. I mean, theoretically, I would want to like make sure I verify that, so that way when you can't delete somebody else's notes. But I won't put those verifications there. Let's just be like doing another checking, making sure that the ID, the user that's making the request matches the user on the item that's being updated or deleted. I could add some checks for that. I recommend that you do down the road, like what you do is just first get it to work, then we can optimize. But I think that should do it. Okay, so let's see here. My index route, again, it's only returning all the notes that belong to the user. Shows is showing whatever notes selected by ID. Okay, post is creating a new note. Then again, we're adding the user ID by that. Okay, update. We are just updating it, and that's fine. Update no params under JSON, that's fine. Destroy. Okay, so I think that's all good. And now let's just take a look at the routes file so you can see how that was done. So again, just to kind of recap the changes here, we added before authorized, so that way we have the authentication set up for these routes. And then I made sure I edited the index route to only show that particular user's notes. And I made sure I edited the create route to make sure that we add the user, assign the user to the note when it's being created. So on that note, let's go to routes here. You see it's pretty straightforward. Notes, resources, routes. That creates all the routes because we do want all 6 resource routes. So in that case, I think we're good. We can start doing the thing. So in that case, I am going to run the server, Rails server. That's running. Go back to Postman. I'm going to log in again because again, you need your token. So I'm going to log in. Okay, I already have the username and password there. Cool. What? Not found. Localhost. Oh, post request. Okay. There we go. I'm logged in. So I'm going to grab my token to show that I'm kind of flash around and say, hey, look, me, I'm logged in. So I'm going to create a new thing. I'm going to add my authorization header. So that way my token's included. Authorization. Bear. Okay. Cool. So that's all there. Now it's just localhost 3000. And it should be the name of the controller, which I always forget it's going to end up being notes. So this is where we want to double check. So I'm going to open up another terminal. Oh, wrong window. Okay, so I'm going to cd into backend. And what I want to do is do Rails routes. So let's see what the notes routes are. Okay, it is notes. Okay, so that's the beauty of that notes command. I can double check what the endpoint's going to be. So /notes. So first I do a GET request, and I have my ID here, so it's going to look up for any notes that are under my name, which should be none. So null. Makes sense. Now let's try to create one. So I'm going to make this a post request. Raw JSON. Okay, so again, it's supposed to have a title property, which is a string. So post 1. And then we have a body property. which is just a bunch of text. So just it's a bunch of gibberish. And that should be it, because again, it's going to add the user. Turtle server record. Expected, got 1. Let's see here. User expected, got, okay. So it got the integer, which was the ID. I think it just wants me to pass the whole user. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to go change the user controller. No, not the user controller, the notes controller. So instead of assigning note.user, I'm just going to assign the whole user to it and see if that fixes it. Okay. So what I'm going to do is Control C, restart the server. Let's see if this works better. Okay, so that worked good. And there it grabbed the right user ID. So yeah, so I just need to pass the whole user in. I don't need to pass the user, specifically the user ID. Okay. Cool. So now that's created. Let's see if I see it when I do a get now. And yep, I see it. There it goes. Good. Okay, now let's create a few more. So post, and let's say post 2. Post 3. Now let's try to update it. So let's see if I go notes ID 3, make this a put request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to name this 3.1. See if it changes it. Yep, changed it to 3.1. Nice. Then we're going to delete it. So I'm going to change this to a delete request. Okay, I'm going to assume that means it's deleted. So then I will delete the ID. Go do a get request. And let's see here. 1. Well, 2 is gone too. I don't remember deleting both of them, but let's see here. If I were to make another one, ID 4. Good enough. I do a get request. It's only returning me 1. So that tells me that chances are this find by function only returns the first one that satisfies the request. So maybe find all is what I wanted. So let me just take a look there. Find by limit 1. I see. Yeah, that's what happens when I. Here we go. We retrieve multiple access. So I do want all. But let's see here. Find each. User where find. Some of the documentation, this doesn't lay it out as clearly as I'd like. No, I don't want find each. Just go back to the find all. Where client where now that what if a number could vary, blah 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 blah. The where method allows you to specify conditions to limit the record's return, representing where part of an SQL statement. So where orders count to, this will find all clients. Okay, so that's what I want. So let's go back. Let's change that. So this is really should be where. What's that where? So let's see here. Control C. Rails server. Let's try that again. And see if that gets us what we want. So I go to get. Yes, that's what we wanted. Cool. Now let's see what happens if I try to take off the header. So I go back over here. I'm going to take off the authorization header. So you can see that the authorization is needed. I hit send. Please log in. See, it won't let me do it unless I'm logged in with the header. So we did it. Okay, we have our API. We are able to create, read, update, delete notes, but you have to be logged in. So in the next video, we'll deploy this to Heroku, and then after that, we'll begin building our React application. But for the most part, we are on the way. We are on the way. I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great one and enjoy.